Welcome to Revenge Mode. Let's hear a story today from La Jolla, San Diego, California. My name is Deanna Sterling and I just turned 30 years old. Last night at my own birthday party inside our family's estate in La Jolla, my father didn't give me a gift. Instead, he slammed a heavy leather folder onto the dinner table right next to my birthday cake. The sound was like a gunshot. It killed the music instantly. 50 guests, business partners, socialites, and relatives froze with their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. My father looked at me, then turned to my grandmother sitting at the head of the table and announced in a voice that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "This is a list of 34 mistakes proving why you don't deserve to be a member of this family anymore. It's time for your brother to take over." My brother standing beside him smirked a look of pure, arrogant victory. My mother stood with her arms crossed, staring at me with cold, unblinking eyes. The entire room held its breath. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg for forgiveness, or to run out of the room in humiliation. I didn't do any of that. I reached out my hand steady and opened the folder. I didn't need to read the first page. I knew exactly what was inside. I flipped straight to the middle to mistake number 12. Before I tell you what was in that folder and why it made the color drain from my parents' faces, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. If you love seeing karma served ice cold to those who deserve it, you are in the right place. My parents watched me read, their smiles tight and triumphant. They thought I was the lamb they had led to the slaughter. They thought I was trapped. I looked up from the page, met my father's eyes, and gave him a small, silent smile. They had no idea. I hadn't come to this party to celebrate. I hadn't come to argue. I had walked into this room tonight with one purpose only: to end their game. The digital clock in the bottom right corner of my monitor flickered to 11:47 p.m. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Estates headquarters, the city of La Jolla was asleep. The ocean was just a vast black void beyond the glass, invisible but audible as a low rhythmic hum against the silence of the empty office. I was the only soul left in the building. While my parents, Richard and Eleanor, were currently enjoying a much-needed spa retreat in Santa Barbara, and my brother Kevin was likely throwing money around at a club in downtown San Diego, I was here. I was buried under a mountain of quarterly variance reports, hunting for a discrepancy that had been nagging at me since Tuesday. I took a sip of cold, stale coffee and rubbed my tired eyes. Being the chief financial officer of the family business sounded glamorous on a business card, but in reality, it meant I was the glorified janitor. I cleaned up the messes. I balanced the books. I ensured the dividends were paid on time so my family could maintain their lifestyle without ever having to look at a spreadsheet. "Come on," I whispered to the glowing screen. "Where are you?" I was cross-referencing the emergency reserve fund against the monthly operational expenses. It was a tedious task, one that didn't technically require C-level oversight, but my grandmother Catherine had instilled a habit in me: trust, but verify. I scrolled down to row 4200. My finger hovered over the mouse, then froze. There was a gap. It wasn't a formatting error. It was a transactional void. The balance of the reserve fund was lighter than it had been 48 hours ago. I frowned, typing in my administrative password to access the raw data logs. The screen refreshed, populating the list of recent outgoing wires. And there it was. Date October 15th. Amount $85,000, $85,000. Recipient KS Global Ventures, LLC. Authorization digital_token_DS_01. I stared at the screen, blinking rapidly, waiting for the numbers to change, for it to be a hallucination induced by sleep deprivation. But the line remained. $85,000. Gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Digital_token_DS_01. That was my token. That was my unique digital signature. But I hadn't authorized this. I hadn't moved a cent from the reserve fund in 6 months. I pulled up the beneficiary details. KS Global Ventures. The name sounded legitimate, corporate, boring, but it scratched at a memory buried in the back of my mind. 2 months ago at a family dinner, Kevin had been bragging about some revolutionary investment project he was consulting for. He hadn't given a name, but I remembered seeing a monogram on a notebook he'd left on the table. K.S. Kevin Sterling. A cold flush of nausea washed over me. I grabbed my phone to call my father, Richard. As the CEO, he needed to know that someone had hacked our system, compromised my credentials, and drained nearly $100,000. I dialed. It went straight to voicemail. I dialed my mother. Voicemail. I dialed Kevin. The line rang and rang until a generic automated message cut in. Panic began to curdle into something sharper: suspicion. It wasn't just the initials, it was the timing. The wire had gone out exactly 1 day after I had updated the security protocols that only 3 people had the master override key: for me, my father, and my grandmother. I couldn't call Grandma Catherine. Not yet. If I accused my brother of embezzlement and was wrong, I would be the villain. I would be the jealous sister trying to sabotage the golden boy. I needed to look my father in the eye. I needed to see his face when I showed him the transaction log. I grabbed my laptop, shoved it into my bag, and ran for the elevator. The drive to my parents' estate took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. A sudden storm had rolled in off the Pacific, turning the roads into slick ribbons of asphalt. Rain lashed against my windshield, matching the chaotic rhythm of my thoughts. It has to be a mistake, I told myself, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Maybe Dad authorized it for a legitimate deal and used my override because he forgot his password. He does that. He's bad with technology. That's all it is. I was lying to myself, and deep down I knew it. I pulled up the long, winding driveway of the Sterling Manor. The house was dark except for a single warm light glowing from the study on the ground floor. So they weren't in Santa Barbara. They were home. They had lied about the trip. I parked my car down the hill, away from the garage, acting on an instinct I didn't fully understand. I didn't want them to hear an engine. I wanted to walk up to the house quietly. I ran through the rain, my heels sinking into the wet grass, and approached the side entrance near the study. I reached for the handle but stopped. Voices. The window was cracked open slightly to let in the ocean breeze, and through the sound of the rain I could hear them. Worried about the audit trail, Richard? My mother's voice drifted out. It wasn't her usual high-pitched socialite tone. It was low, sharp, and annoyed. 85,000 isn't a small amount to just vanish. I froze, pressing my back against the cold stone wall of the house. The rain soaked through my blouse, chilling me to the bone, but I didn't move. Stop pacing, Eleanor, you're making me dizzy, my father snapped. There was the clink of glass against glass, whiskey probably. I covered it. I labeled it under confidential acquisition. It's buried deep in the subledger. But Deanna checks the ledgers, my mother countered. She checks everything. She's obsessed. She checks the operational expenses, Richard said, his voice slurring slightly. She respects the hierarchy too much to pry into executive confidential files. I told her those folders are for my eyes only. I held my breath, my hand covering my mouth to stifle a gasp. Are you sure? Eleanor asked. Because if she finds out we used her signature to fund Kevin's gambling debts again, she'll go straight to your mother. And if Catherine finds out, we are all cut off. She won't. Richard laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. That's the beauty of Deanna. She's a workhorse. She's a machine. She believes in the process. She believes in loyalty. She's too naive to think her own parents would set her up. My mother sighed. The sound of ice rattling in a glass followed. You're right. She's pathetic that way. Just make sure Kevin keeps his mouth shut. We can't have him buying a new Porsche tomorrow and raising eyebrows. I'll handle Kevin. You just keep playing the supportive mother role if Deanna asks why we canceled the Santa Barbara trip. Tell her I had a migraine. The conversation drifted into silence, leaving only the sound of the storm battering the coast. I stood there in the dark, the rain mingling with the hot tears that had started to streak down my face. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, hollowed out from the inside. It wasn't just the theft. The $85,000 was almost irrelevant compared to the words I had just heard. Workhorse, machine, pathetic. They didn't see me as a daughter. They didn't even see me as a person. To Richard and Eleanor, I was nothing more than a useful utility, a firewall they could hide behind, while they drained the family fortune to enable my brother's addiction. They weren't protecting the family, they were cannibalizing it, and they had chosen me as the main course. I looked at the warm light of the window one last time. A part of me, the part that was still their little girl, wanted to burst into that room, scream, and demand an apology. I wanted to beg them to say it wasn't true, but the Deanna who did that would lose. That Deanna was the naive girl they relied on. I slowly backed away from the window. I retraced my steps through the wet grass, careful not to make a sound. I got back into my car, my hands shaking so hard I could barely put the key in the ignition. I didn't turn on the headlights until I was halfway down the hill. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't go home to sleep. As I drove through the rain, the shock began to harden into something cold and heavy in my chest. They were right about one thing: I respected the process, and now I was going to use that process to burn them to the ground. The silence following my discovery didn't last long. 2 weeks after I found the missing $85,000, the atmosphere in the Sterling family shifted from negligent to predatory. It started with a Sunday brunch at the estate. The patio was bathed in the warm La Jolla sunlight, but the air at the table was frigid. My grandmother, Catherine, sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid as she sipped her Earl Grey tea. She placed her porcelain cup down with a deliberate clink that silenced the polite conversation about golf handicaps and charity galas. "I have made a decision," Catherine announced, her sharp eyes sweeping over Richard, Eleanor, and finally resting on me. "Deanna turns 30 in 2 weeks. It is a milestone. It is also the age I was when my father handed me the keys to the kingdom." My father, Richard, froze with a forkful of smoked salmon halfway to his mouth. "Mother, what are you implying?" "I am not implying anything, Richard. I am stating," Catherine said, her voice steel wrapped in velvet. "On the morning of Deanna's birthday, I will be conducting a grand internal audit of Sterling Estates. I will review every ledger, every investment, and every operational cost from the last 5 years. If the company is as healthy as you claim, I will begin the process of transferring the CEO title to the next generation." She looked directly at me. "To Deanna." The color drained from my mother's face so fast I thought she might faint. Richard dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his plate. "An audit?" Richard stammered, a bead of sweat instantly appearing on his temple. "But surely that isn't necessary. The quarterly reports are impeccable. Deanna sends them to you herself." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Catherine said simply. "Do you?" Richard forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Of course not. We welcome it." I sat quietly, buttering my toast, but inside I saw the panic radiating off my parents like heat waves. They were terrified. An audit meant Catherine would see the holes. She would see the drains. She would see the theft. They needed a plan. And by Monday morning, they had one. I arrived at the office at 8 a.m. to find a stranger sitting in the executive conference room. It was Kevin. My brother, who usually didn't wake up before noon, was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, his feet propped up on the mahogany table. Richard walked in behind me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt heavy, oppressive. "Deanna, good news," Richard said, his voice overly loud, overly cheerful. "With the audit coming up, I realized you're overburdened. You look exhausted, sweetheart. So I've appointed Kevin as our temporary strategic advisor. He's going to help you organize the files for grandmother." I looked at Kevin. He smirked, spinning a pen between his fingers. Hey, sis. Looks like you need a little help cleaning up your mess. I don't need help, I said, keeping my voice neutral. And I certainly don't need an advisor who has never read a balance sheet. Now, Eleanor chimed in, walking through the door with a tray of coffees. Don't be jealous, Deanna. Kevin has a fresh perspective. You've been working so hard lately you're starting to make mistakes. We're just here to support you. The gaslighting had begun. For the next 10 days, my office became a war zone. Richard used his CEO override to grant Kevin full administrative access to the financial database. Kevin didn't delete anything that would have left a jagged hole in the data logs that even a junior auditor could spot. Instead, he did something more insidious. He edited. I watched it happen in real time from my terminal. I would open a spreadsheet to check the return on investment ROI for our commercial properties, and the numbers would be slightly off. A formula in cell G14 would be altered to inflate expenses by 2%. A decimal point in the tax liability column would be shifted. These weren't random errors. They were calculated adjustments designed to make the books look chaotic. They were painting a picture of a CFO who was sloppy, disorganized, and losing control of the cash flow. If Catherine looked at these files, she wouldn't see embezzlement immediately. She would see incompetence. She would see a granddaughter who wasn't ready to lead. And once my credibility was destroyed, Richard would discover the missing money and blame it on my negligence. Deanna, did you forget to file the vendor invoices again? Kevin asked loudly on Thursday afternoon, standing in the middle of the open plan office so the junior staff could hear. Man, you really are losing it. Mom was right about your stress levels. I looked up from my screen. I saw the whispers exchanging between the employees. Is she sick? Is she burning out? I filed them yesterday, Kevin. I said calmly. Check the folder. He shrugged. It's empty. I checked. The folder was empty. He had moved them. You really need to sleep more. He laughed, walking away. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't fix the files back to their original state. If I engaged in a tug of war over the data, Richard would just lock me out of the system entirely. I needed them to think they were winning. I needed them to think I was too overwhelmed to notice the sabotage. But I wasn't alone in this fight. At 3 a.m. on the Friday before my birthday, the Sterling Estates building was a tomb. I swiped my keycard into the server room. The heavy door clicked open, revealing the hum of cooling fans and the blinking blue lights of the data towers. I'm in, I whispered into my Bluetooth earpiece. Okay, I'm seeing the connection. Joanna's voice came through, crisp and alert. I've bypassed the firewall using the back door you set up. We have a narrow window before the system runs its automated backup and overwrites the logs. Joanna was my best friend, but more importantly, she was a forensic accountant and attorney who specialized in corporate fraud. While my parents thought I was crying in the bathroom, I had been meeting with her every night, building our case. Kevin has been busy, I said, connecting my encrypted hard drive to the main terminal. He altered the Q3 projections and shifted the debt ratio on the La Jolla development project. He's trying to hide the $85,000 withdrawal by inflating the construction costs. He's sloppy, Joanna noted. He's changing the surface numbers, but he's not reconciling the metadata. It's amateur hour. It's enough to fool grandmother if she just looks at the printed reports Richard hands her. I replied. That's their plan. Show her a disastrous report on my birthday claim, I'm mentally unstable, fire me, and then Kevin takes over and buries the theft forever. Not if we have the original snapshot, Joanna said. Initiate the clone. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't just copying files, I was creating a forensic image of the entire server state before Kevin's final edits took permanent hold. I was capturing the before picture. Original entry $85,000 withdrawal. Auth token _DS_01 spoofed. Edit history. User K underscore strat underscore ad changed cell B45. Edit history. User K underscore strat underscore ad moved folder invoices to trash. The progress bar on my screen crawled forward. Green pixels against a black background. 20%. 50%. 80%. Come on, I breathed. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would trigger the motion sensors. If Richard walked in now, if the security guard did his rounds early, it was over. 99%. Complete. Got it, Joanna said triumphantly in my ear. The drive is encrypted. I have a copy on my cloud, and you have the physical hard drive. Let them print their fake reports, Deanna. Let them print a mountain of lies. We have the truth. I pulled the drive from the server, the metal warm in my hand. I slipped it into my pocket right next to my heart. They are going to humiliate me tomorrow night, Joanna, I said, staring at the blinking lights of the server that contained the ruin of my family. They invited half of La Jolla to watch me fall. Then let them watch. Joanna's voice was fierce. Because when you fall, you're going to land on them. And you're going to crush them. I walked out of the server room and locked the door. For the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't feel tired. I felt dangerous. The sun began to dip below the horizon line of the Pacific Ocean, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and orange across the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. To an outsider, the scene looked like a page torn from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Valets were already lined up in their crisp white jackets, ready to receive the parade of Bentleys and Porsches winding their way up the cliffside drive. Inside the grand hall, however, the air was thin and sharp, charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a violent storm. I arrived an hour early, not as the guest of honor, but as the grim executioner walking to her own scaffold, or so my family thought. I wasn't alone. Joanna walked beside me carrying a sleek silver laptop case like a weapon. Are you sure about this? I asked quietly as we entered the ballroom. I'm a lawyer, Deanna. I'm always sure, Joanna whispered back, scanning the room. Where is the AV control? Behind the heavy velvet curtains on the east wall. It connects to the main LED wall behind the stage. We moved quickly. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were too busy screaming at the caterers about the temperature of the crab cakes to notice us. This was the one advantage of being the invisible daughter. Even on my birthday, no one paid attention to where I was or what I was doing. Joanna slipped behind the curtain. She was officially here as my guest, but we had told the event planner, a nervous woman named Sarah, who was terrified of my mother, that Joanna was handling a sentimental family slideshow for the party. It was the perfect cover. My parents were too narcissistic to organize a photo montage of my childhood themselves, so they were relieved someone else was doing the grunt work. I watched as Joanna connected her laptop to the system. She brought up a folder labeled Deanna_birthday_memories. Inside were a few innocuous photos of me as a toddler. But underneath that interface running in the background was the encrypted mirror image of the company server we had stolen the night before. We are live, Joanna murmured into her headset, adjusting her blazer. The cable is secure. The moment you give the signal, I switch the input source. No lag. Good, I said, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I had chosen my outfit carefully. For years I had worn sensible gray suits and modest blouses, trying to fit the mold of the dutiful professional CFO. Tonight I wore midnight blue. It was dark, sharp, and commanding. I didn't dress like a victim. I dressed like the CEO I was about to become. By 7:00 p.m. the room was full. The elite of La Jolla had arrived, filling the space with the murmur of gossip and the clinking of crystal. These weren't my friends. They were my parents' business associates, investors, and social rivals. They were the audience Richard needed for his performance. I stood near a pillar holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the players take their positions. My mother Eleanor was fluttering between groups of guests like a hummingbird laughing too loudly, her hand resting possessively on Kevin's arm whenever she introduced him. "Have you met Kevin? He's consulting for the firm now. Brilliant mind just like his father." My father Richard stood near the bar nursing a scotch. He looked flushed, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few minutes, checking for the arrival of the one person who mattered. And then she entered. The room quieted noticeably as Catherine Sterling walked in. At 82, my grandmother moved slower than she used to, leaning on her ivory-handled cane, but her presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked straight to the high-backed chair at the head of the main table, her throne. I caught her eye across the room. I gave a small, respectful nod. Catherine didn't nod back. Her gaze was cold, assessing, filled with a mixture of disappointment and fatigue. The lies my parents had fed her about my mental instability had clearly taken root. She was waiting for me to fail. She was waiting for the audit to prove I was unfit. "Just wait, grandmother," I thought. "Just wait." "You look tense, sis." The voice came from my left. I turned to see Kevin standing there, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. He was wearing a tuxedo that was slightly too tight, a smug grin plastered across his face. He stepped into my personal space, lowering his voice so the nearby guests couldn't hear the venom dripping from his words. "Chi trong met moi quoi?" "You look so tired," he said, feigning concern. "I mean, really, Deanna. The dark circles. The shaking hands. Mom was right. This job is eating you alive." I didn't step back. I held my ground. "I'm fine, Kevin. Never better." He chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "Don't lie to me. We all know today is the end of the line for you. Grandma is watching you like a hawk. One wrong move, and you're out." He took a sip of his wine, leaning in closer, his breath smelling of alcohol and entitlement. "Hai vong lat nua chi chu josh ap luk. I hope you can handle the pressure later," he whispered. "Boko mot mon qua. Rat jak biet je gyup chi inghin goy vin vien." Honestly, it's a mercy. You'll thank us when you're relaxing in a clinic somewhere. His threat was clear. They weren't just planning to fire me. They were planning to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I would be unhireable, forced into some rehabilitation narrative they had concocted. Permanent rest meant professional death. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear behind his arrogance. I saw a boy who had never worked a day in his life, who needed to destroy his sister to hide his own crimes. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf watching a rabbit run into a snare. "Cam on him." "Thank you," I said, raising my glass in a mock toast. "Chi kung rat mong chok jem I se la, ngoi juoch ngingoi toine." I'm also very much looking forward to seeing who gets to rest tonight. Kevin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He clearly hadn't expected me to be this calm. He searched my face for signs of panic, but found none. "Enjoy the champagne, Deanna," he sneered, pulling away. "It's the last thing you'll ever drink in this house." He turned and walked away, joining our parents on the small stage set up at the front of the room. Richard tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father boomed, his voice projecting the fake warmth of a practiced liar. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." The music died down. The chatter stopped. The spotlight swung toward the stage, blindingly bright. I took a deep breath, setting my glass down on a passing waiter's tray. I caught Joanna's eye across the room. She was poised over her laptop, her finger hovering over the enter key. She gave me a barely perceptible nod. The preparation was over. The execution was about to begin. The feedback from the microphone sliced through the air, a high-pitched whine that made several guests wince. Richard tapped the device twice, demanding absolute silence. The string quartet in the corner lowered their bows, and the murmurs of the crowd died down until the only sound was the distant crash of the ocean waves against the cliffs below. Richard stood center stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. He looked every inch the grieving patriarch forced to make a terrible sacrifice for the greater good. He adjusted his silk tie, his face arranging itself into a mask of solemn duty. "Thank you all for coming." Richard began, his voice deep and resonant. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone for my daughter Deanna. But as the CEO of Sterling Estates, and as a father who loves this family too much to see it ruined, I have a difficult duty to perform." He paused for effect, looking out over the crowd. I watched from the shadows of the pillar, my pulse steady, my hand gripping the stem of my water glass. Beside me, Joanna was staring at her laptop screen, her finger hovering over the execute key, waiting for my signal. Integrity. Richard continued, his eyes drifting toward my grandmother, Catherine. "That is the foundation of this family, but lately that foundation has been cracking. We have discovered serious irregularities in the company, financial mismanagement, erratic behavior, decisions made not with the mind, but with instability." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. People turned to look at me. I saw pity in some eyes, malicious glee in others. "I have tried to guide her," Richard said, his voice cracking with fake emotion. "Her mother and I have tried to help. But when an employee, even a family member, threatens the legacy my mother built, tough love is the only option left." He reached under the podium and pulled out the heavy black leather folder. This was the moment. The same moment I had teased in the beginning, but living it now in real time. The air felt heavier, thicker. The sound of the folder hitting the table wasn't just a noise, it was a declaration of war. Thud. "Deanna," Richard called out, pointing a finger at me. "Come up here." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. I felt hundreds of eyes boring into my skin. I didn't hesitate. I walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I didn't look down. I kept my chin high, my expression unreadable. As I stepped onto the stage, the heat of the spotlight hit me. My mother Eleanor stood to the side, her arms crossed, shaking her head as if she couldn't bear to look at me. Kevin was grinning openly now, rocking back and forth on his heels, eager for the show to begin. "This," Richard said, placing his hand on the folder, "is a formal performance review. A list of 34 specific incidents, errors, and behavioral issues that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are unfit to lead. Unfit to be a Sterling." He pushed the folder toward me. "Read it," he commanded. "Read it to your grandmother. Read it to our investors. Let them hear from your own mouth why we are asking you to step down and let Kevin take over." He thought he was shaming me. He thought he was forcing me to confess my sins. He had no idea he was handing me a loaded gun. I stepped up to the podium. I looked at Catherine. She was leaning forward, her knuckles white on her cane, her eyes narrowed. She wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at me, waiting. I opened the folder. The first page was a wall of text, petty grievances typed in bold font. "Read it," Richard barked, leaning into the mic. "Start with number 1. I leaned into the microphone. My voice didn't shake. It was clear, cool, and loud enough to reach the back of the room. "Mistake number 1, I read. Deanna creates a hostile work environment by refusing to engage in casual brainstorming with the strategic advisor, leading to a breakdown in family synergy." I paused. A few guests exchanged confused glances. Casual brainstorming was Kevin's code for drinking scotch in my office at 2:00 p.m. "Go on," Kevin heckled from the side. "Read the one about the clients." I flipped the page. Mistake number 5. I continued, skipping the filler. "She consistently undermines the authority of the CEO by questioning expense reports, showing a lack of trust and a jealous nature toward her brother's rising success." My mother nodded vigorously from the sidelines, dabbing a dry eye with a handkerchief. "It's true," she whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "She's always been so jealous." I looked at the pages. They were filled with lies. She forgot the meeting. She lost the file. She was rude to the donor. It was a comprehensive assassination of my character, carefully constructed to make me look like a bitter, incompetent failure. Richard stepped closer, invading my personal space. Read the financial section, Deanna. Show them how you lost control of the accounts. Show them why we can't trust you with the checkbook anymore. He was getting impatient. He wanted the kill shot. He wanted me to read the part where they claimed I was confused about the money. I turned the page to item number 12. I stared at the paragraph. It was beautiful. It was the most arrogant, foolish thing I had ever seen. In their haste to frame me, in their absolute certainty that I was too stupid to understand the nuances of the ledger, they had written down a specific accusation to prove my ignorance. They thought writing it down made it a fact. They didn't realize they were documenting a crime. I let silence hang in the room for 5 long seconds. The tension stretched tight as a wire. "Well," Richard sneered, "cat got your tongue, read it. Or are you too ashamed?" I looked up. I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled all night. "No, Father," I said. "I'm not ashamed. I just want to make sure I get the wording exactly right." I took a deep breath, and I read. Mistake number 12. She is so incompetent in controlling cash flow that she is completely unaware the board approved a transfer of $85,000 to venture capital KS on the 15th of last month. I stopped. The words hung in the air, echoing slightly in the vast hall. For a moment, nobody moved. The guests blinked, processing the sentence. $85,000, venture capital KS the 15th. Richard's smug expression faltered. His brow furrowed. He hadn't expected me to read that specific line with such clarity. He had expected me to mumble it, to cry over the accusation of incompetence. He hadn't expected me to treat it like a headline. I slowly closed the folder. The soft thud of the leather cover closing was louder than a shout. I turned my body, shifting my attention away from the audience and focusing entirely on Richard. He was standing 3 feet away, and I watched the blood drain from his face as the realization hit him. He had just forced me to read a statement claiming the board had approved the transfer. A transfer that was supposed to be secret. A transfer that was disguised as a theft. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice magnified by the speaker's calm and deadly. "I have always wondered who approved that transfer. I searched the logs for weeks. I thought it was a hack. But it turns out you just admitted in front of grandmother and everyone here that you knew about it all along." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Eleanor. She was frozen, her hand clutching her pearls. He looked at Kevin. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. I turned to the side of the stage and locked eyes with Catherine. "Did you hear that, grandmother?" I asked. "The CEO just confessed to authorizing an $85,000 transfer to a company that doesn't exist in our vendor list, an authorization that was signed with my stolen digital token." The trap had snapped shut, and Richard Sterling was standing right in the middle of it. The silence that had fallen over the room following my accusation was shattered by a sound sharp enough to crack stone. It was the sound of my grandmother's cane striking the marble floor. Catherine Sterling stood up. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, honed by decades of boardroom warfare, cut through the air with terrifying clarity. "Venture capital KS." She repeated, her eyes locking onto Richard like a laser sight. "I review every single investment proposal personally, Richard. I have never seen that name. I have never signed a document authorizing a transfer to such an entity. And I certainly never gave you permission to override the reserve fund protocols." Richard's face, which had been pale a moment ago, flushed a deep, blotchy red. He stepped back from the podium, his hands shaking as he tried to adjust his tie, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Mother, please," he stammered, his voice cracking. It was a confidential acquisition, a shell company for tax purposes. You know how these things are. I didn't want to burden you with the details until the deal was closed. Deanna is twisting the facts. She's trying to confuse you. He turned to the audio technician booth at the back of the room, his panic turning into aggression. He pointed a trembling finger at the sound guy. "Cut her mic!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Cut it now! Get security! Get her off the stage! She's having a breakdown." The technician, a young man who looked terrified, fumbled with the mixing board. The speakers let out a sharp pop, and my microphone went dead. Richard exhaled, a momentary look of relief crossing his face. He thought silencing my voice would silence the truth. He thought he could regain control of the narrative if he just yelled loud enough. But I didn't need a microphone anymore. I looked over Richard's shoulder past his frantic gestures and made eye contact with Joanna. She was still standing calmly by the pillar, her finger poised over the enter key. I gave a single sharp nod. Behind me, the massive LED screen that spanned the entire back wall of the stage flickered. The slideshow of Deanna's childhood memories, the innocent photos of me blowing out candles on my 5th birthday, vanished instantly. The screen went black for a heartbeat. Then it illuminated the room with a stark, blinding white light. Gasps erupted from the audience. It wasn't a photo. It was a document. High-resolution, crisp, and magnified so that even the guests in the back row could read the fine print. It was a bank statement. Specifically, the Level 5 confidential transaction log from the Sterling Estates corporate server. Richard turned around to see what the crowd was staring at. When he saw the screen, his knees actually buckled. He grabbed the podium to keep from collapsing. I stepped back to the center of the stage. The handheld microphone was dead, but the podium mic, the one Richard had been using, was still live. I leaned into it. "You can cut the audio, Father," I said, my voice booming through the hall again. "But you can't cut the data. Numbers don't lie." I pointed to the screen. "Let's look at the details, shall we? This is the raw data log from the night of October 15th. As you can see, the recipient is listed as KS Global Ventures. A very professional-sounding name." I signaled Joanna again. The screen changed. The bank statement dissolved into a corporate registry search result. But when we run a trace on the routing number, I continued acting as the dispassionate auditor I was trained to be. We don't find a venture capital firm. We find a private holding account registered in Nevada. "Stop this!" Eleanor shrieked from the side of the stage. She rushed forward, grabbing Richard's arm. "She hacked the system. She's forging documents. Someone stop her." I ignored her. "And what does KS stand for?" The screen shifted again. This time it showed the account ownership details. Owner Kevin Sterling. The room exploded into noise. Shocked exclamations, nervous laughter, and outraged whispers filled the air. Kevin, who had been standing arrogantly with his wine glass just minutes ago, looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. He dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine staining the white carpet like blood. "That's a lie," Kevin yelled, his voice shrill. "That's Photoshop. She made it up." "Did I asked. "Let's see where the money went." Joanna hit the key for the final slide. This was the coup de grace. It was a split-screen view of the transaction history for the KS Global account. On the left side of the screen, a list of withdrawals appeared in red ink. $40,000. The Sapphire Room Casino, Las Vegas. $15,000. High Limit Lounge. Marker repayment. $12,000 online transfer. BetMGM. I looked at my brother. "It seems KS Global has a very specific investment strategy, Kevin. Roulette and blackjack." Then I looked at my mother. "But Kevin wasn't the only beneficiary," I said softly. On the right side of the screen, the remaining transactions appeared. $8,500, Neiman Marcus, Beverly Hills. $6,000, Cartier, San Diego. $3,500, Ella Jola. Cosmetic Surgery Center. The room went deadly silent. The evidence was irrefutable. My mother, the woman who had spent the last 2 weeks telling everyone I was mentally unstable, had used the stolen company funds to buy jewelry and handbags. "You stole from the reserve fund," I said, addressing my parents directly. "You forged my digital signature to bypass the security protocols. And when I found the discrepancy, you didn't confess. You didn't apologize. You decided to frame me. You decided to destroy my career and my reputation to cover up your own greed." Richard was hyperventilating. Eleanor was sobbing, her hands covering her face. Kevin, however, snapped. The humiliation was too much for his ego to handle. He looked at the giant screen broadcasting his gambling addiction to the entire social elite of California, and his eyes went wild. He spotted a large, broad-shouldered security guard standing near the AV booth. "Turn it off," Kevin screamed, pointing at the screen. "Hey, you security. Pull the plug. Rip it out of the wall. She's slandering us. Turn it off right now." The security guard, a man named Marcus, who had worked for our family for 5 years, looked hesitant. He looked at Kevin. Then he looked at Richard. Richard nodded frantically, desperation in his eyes. "Do as he says," Richard bellowed. "Shut it down." Marcus stepped forward, reaching for the thick black power cable that fed the LED wall. "Stop!" The command didn't come from me. It came from Catherine. She had moved from her chair. She was standing at the edge of the stage, her cane raised in the air like a scepter. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the security guard. "Don't you dare touch that cable, Marcus," Catherine said. Her voice was low, but it carried the absolute terrifying authority of the woman who signed the paychecks. Marcus froze his hand inches from the plug. He looked at Catherine, saw the fire in her eyes, and immediately stepped back, clasping his hands behind his back. Kevin looked at his grandmother, his face twisting in confusion and fear. "Grandma, what are you doing? She's lying. You have to stop her." Catherine slowly turned her gaze to Kevin, then to Richard, and, finally, to Eleanor. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was total, icy contempt. "I have spent 40 years building this company," Catherine said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I have survived recessions, lawsuits, and competitors. I will not let my own family destroy it in the dark." She slammed the tip of her cane onto the stage floor. "Leave the screen on," she commanded. "I want to see it all. I want to see every single cent you stole. I want to see the end of this play." She turned to me. Her expression softened just a fraction into something that looked like respect. "Finish it, Deanna," she said. I nodded. The room was mine. The truth was out. And there was nowhere left for them to hide. The image of the bank transactions burned on the giant screen behind me, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the faces of the people who were supposed to love me. My grandmother, Catherine Sterling, stared at the numbers for a long time. When she finally turned away from the screen, the look she gave my father, mother, and brother was not one of anger. Anger implies passion. Anger implies that you still care. What I saw in her eyes was something far more devastating, absolute chilling disgust. She looked at them as if they were strangers, as if they were a stain on the carpet that needed to be removed. "You stole from the reserve fund," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to the back of the silent ballroom. "You stole from the legacy I built for your children, and when you were caught, you tried to destroy the only person in this family who actually has a spine." "Mother, please," Richard begged, sweat pouring down his face, ruining his expensive collar. "We can fix this. It's just money. We can pay it back. Don't make a scene in front of the investors." "A scene?" Catherine laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The scene is over, Richard. Now comes the curtain call." As if on cue, the double mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. 2 officers in dark uniforms walked in, followed by a detective in a plain suit. They didn't look like they were here for a party. They moved with the grim efficiency of the law. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide corridor of shame leading directly to the stage. Kevin saw them first, his bravado already cracked, shattered completely. "No!" he whimpered, backing away until he bumped into the podium. "No, no, no. Dad, do something, you said you'd handle it." Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the handcuffs hanging from the detective's belt. I stepped forward, holding the microphone one last time. "I didn't just hack the server to make a slideshow, Father," I said calmly. "I sent the forensic data, the forged digital tokens, and the IP trace of the gambling accounts to the San Diego District Attorney's office at 4:00 p.m. this afternoon. They issued the warrants an hour ago." You called the police on your own family?" Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest. "How could you? After everything we've done for you?" "You didn't do anything for me, Mother," I replied, my voice devoid of hate, just filled with a heavy final acceptance. "You used me. You used my work ethic to fund your lifestyle, and you used my loyalty to cover your crimes. But you forgot one thing: I am an auditor, and I always balance the books." The detective stepped onto the stage. "Richard Sterling, Eleanor Sterling, Kevin Sterling." "This is a misunderstanding," Richard tried to say, putting on his CEO voice, but it faltered when the detective spun him around. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer recited the metal cuffs clicking shut around my father's wrists. There was no dramatic fight. There was no escape. Just the cold, mechanical reality of consequences arriving after years of delay. Eleanor began to sob, a loud, ugly sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "My bag, let me get my bag," she cried as an officer escorted her down the stairs. Kevin was the worst. As they cuffed him, he turned on his parents. "They made me do it," he screamed, his face wet with tears. "I didn't want to. Dad said it was okay. Dad said Deanna wouldn't mind. It's not my fault." I watched them go. I watched my father, who had terrified me for 30 years, look small and defeated as he was led past his business rivals. I watched my mother, who had criticized every outfit I ever wore, look disheveled and broken. I watched my brother, the golden child, show the world exactly how hollow he really was. They were led out the front doors into the flashing red and blue lights that waited in the driveway. The guests watched in stunned silence. The party was over. The Sterling dynasty as they knew it was dead. An hour later, the ballroom was empty. The staff was quietly clearing away the untouched champagne glasses and the cake that had never been cut. I stood on the balcony looking out at the dark ocean. The storm had passed, leaving the air smelling of salt and rain. "Deanna." I turned to see my grandmother standing in the doorway. She looked older tonight. The invincible Catherine Sterling suddenly seemed fragile. She walked over to me and leaned on the railing. For a long time we just watched the waves crash against the rocks below. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. She didn't look at me. "I let them poison my ear. I listened to their lies about you perhaps because I wanted to believe that Richard was capable. I wanted to believe my son wasn't a failure." "I know," I said softly. "You saved the company tonight," Catherine continued. She turned to face me, her eyes regaining some of their steel. "With Richard and Kevin gone, there is a vacuum. The board will panic. The stock will drop." She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I want you to take over Deanna. Not as a placeholder. As CEO. I will announce it tomorrow morning. You are the only one with the intelligence and the integrity to rebuild this. The house, the estate, the legacy. It's all yours." I looked down at her hand, then back at the empty ballroom. I looked at the stage where I had stood an hour ago. I thought about the 30 years I had spent in this house, trying to be perfect, trying to earn love through spreadsheets and silence. I thought about the office, the late nights, the feeling of being a workhorse. Taking the job would be the ultimate victory. I would be the queen of the castle that had tried to exile me. I would have the power, the money, and the title. But then I looked at the open door leading to the driveway. "No," I said. Catherine blinked, confused. "Excuse me. I can't do it, grandmother," I said gently, withdrawing my hand. "I can't stay here." "But this is your birthright," she insisted. "You won. You defeated them. Why would you walk away now?" "Because if I stay, I'm just cleaning up their mess again," I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. I spent my whole life trying to fix this family, trying to be good enough so they wouldn't hurt me. If I take this job, I'm still trapped in that cycle. I'm still living in Richard's shadow, even if he's in a cell. I looked around the opulent, cold mansion. "This place isn't a home, grandmother. It's a battlefield, and I'm done fighting. I don't want to heal in the same place that broke me." Catherine stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, a sad smile touched her lips. "You are more like me than I realized," she whispered. "You have the one thing I never had, the courage to leave." "Goodbye, grandmother," I said. "Call me if you want to have lunch, but don't call me about business." I walked away from the balcony. I walked through the empty hall past the remnants of my birthday party and out the front door. Outside, the air was crisp and cool. Joanna was waiting for me in her beat-up sedan, the engine idling. It wasn't a Bentley. It wasn't a Porsche. It was beautiful. I threw my bag in the back seat and climbed in. "So," Joanna asked, putting the car in gear, "did you take the keys to the kingdom?" "No," I smiled, leaning my head back against the seat. "I gave them back." We drove down the winding cliffside road, leaving the lights of the Sterling estate behind us in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. Not once. 6 months later. The sign on the door was small frosted glass with simple black lettering, "Sterling and Associates, Forensic Accounting." It wasn't a skyscraper. It was a small office in downtown San Diego with a view of a coffee shop, not the ocean. But it was mine. I sat at my desk reviewing a file for a new client. The phone rang and I picked it up myself. No assistants, no gatekeepers. I wasn't a billionaire heiress anymore. I drove a leased car. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. I worked hard, but at 6 p.m. I went home. I slept through the night. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it. They ask if I regret walking away from a dynasty, from the millions, from the power. They look at my small office, and they see a step down. Voiceover. They ask me if I lost everything that night. I tell them no. I gained everything. Because the greatest asset a human being can own isn't a trust fund or a CEO title or a mansion on a hill. It is the ability to look in the mirror and like who you see. My parents and my brother are currently awaiting trial. They are trapped in a prison of their own making. I am here in this small office paying my own rent, drinking cheap coffee, and I have never felt richer. Boundaries aren't just lines in the sand. They are the walls of your own personal kingdom. And for the first time in 30 years, the only person sitting on the throne of my life is me. Justice wasn't the gift I received that night. Justice was the tool. The gift was freedom.